Okay, folks at home, can you now hear us? Yeah. Yes, okay, brilliant, good. Just want to make sure we were okay on that front. Hey everybody, so glad you're here. Thanks to everyone who's joining us virtually. This is our second Holstein Colloquium series event post-COVID, in COVID times. I don't know, this was a long-running colloquium series prior to the pandemic, a very long-running series, and then it was renamed semi-recently after a colleague from social and cultural sciences, Jim Holstein, who really helped organize and facilitate a lot of these, a lot of the colloquium series talks, and I'm told also baked and brought goodies along to the talks whenever he, yeah, I know. So sorry to let you down on the home baked goodies front. We will work on that. But we're excited to have the colloquium series back up and running, and glad to have this like space for scholars to share their work and have discussions. Historically, it's been a really kind of informal colloquium kind of like event, right? So people can bring, you know, anything from half-baked ideas to fully fleshed out scholarly work and anywhere in between. And so it's an informal kind of space. Hopefully we'll have some good discussion afterwards, not necessarily like a formal Q&A. But we'll have talk for about 45-ish minutes and then a good chunk of time left afterwards for Q&A. All right, so without further ado, I am very honored to introduce Dr. Jonah Birch, who is a visiting professor in the Department of Social and Cultural Sciences this year. If you know Jonah personally or have had him as a professor in your classes, you know what a privilege it has been and is to get to know him and have him in our department this year. It's just been really a joy, Jonah.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. So I want to pass it over to Jonah. I'm just going to get the PowerPoint set up so that it's screen sharing for those of you at home. Once we share the screen, we won't be able to see the chat. But after Jonah's talk, I'll come back up. And if you want to ask questions in the chat, I'll open the chat so we can all see it. Okay, let's see. Okay. All right.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So I should say, you know, this is the first time that I've presented this. So we'll see how it goes. Some of the slides are a little text heavy, but you know, bear with me a little bit, and you can check on my French pronunciation, which gets worse as the day goes on. You know, I'm warning you right now. So this is based on my dissertation research, which was on the 35-hour work week in France and attempts to reduce working time in Europe in general. I'm thinking of turning this into a non-academic book, basically. So, you know, just keep that in mind. That's where it's coming from, or that's the focus of this. It's primarily about a set of laws that were passed in the late 1990s in France under what was called a plural left coalition government under a prime minister named Lionel Jospin, who was a Socialist Party prime minister. He headed a government that included ministers from the French Communist Party and the Green Party as well. So it was kind of a broad left coalition. It was the most ambitious attempt to reduce full-time work hours that Europe has seen in the last 4 decades, really. But it was part of a larger fight over working time. I would say it's a fight that's still going on. You'll see, you know, if you read the news today, you'll see that there's a lot of discussion in Europe in particular about experiments with a 4-day work week or a 32-hour work week, essentially with shorter full-time work hours. So that's on the one hand. And then on the other hand, in Europe right now, part of the response to COVID has been efforts to maintain employment levels through what you could call flexible work time arrangements. These are essentially arrangements in which employees see their hour, you know, employees of companies that are facing economic problems have their hours temporarily cut, but they don't lose their jobs. Instead, either in some of these arrangements, governments will come in and provide partial compensation for the lost income, or in other versions of this, they'll work less now, but the promise is they're going to work longer hours in the future. In particular, in Germany, it's been a major way that governments have attempted to save jobs after the 2008 financial crisis and again during COVID. A lot of those plans have been adopted elsewhere. In France as well, there's large-scale use of policies that are called partial unemployment. Basically, the government is paying you partial unemployment, but you keep your job. I'm making an argument about working time and how to reduce working hours, really. And the argument is fundamentally that the key to doing it successfully in a way that benefits workers is to impose very strict regulations, very strict controls on business. That the more you rely on business to voluntarily agree to negotiate over working hours, the more they're going to use reductions in working time, essentially to reorganize the labor process at the expense of workers, to cut wages and cut pay in the short run, and to make sure that they are not paying for work that they don't need done, essentially. And the result for employees is a lot of uncertainty and insecurity about their schedules, and a lot of individualization, individual plans, essentially, around the working time. It's the opposite of what the original vision of working time reduction was for European trade unions and labor movements in the 1970s, when the idea of a 35-hour work week was adopted by left-wing unions all over the continent. So in Germany, by the German metal workers, a very strong trade union. In France, by a union, one of the two big labor confederations. It's called the CFDT, the Democratic French Confederation of Labor, which at the time was dabbling in notions of democratizing work, of humanizing work. They were talking a lot about worker self-management. And so this was seen as a way of making employment more humane and more pro-labor. Yeah, more essentially something that was better for workers. It was going to give workers better work-life balance. It was going to allow people to better balance their private life, their home life, with the demands of work. It was going to be a job creation measure, as we'll talk about, and that was a major motivation. The idea being that you reduce hours for current employees and you compel employers to hire more workers to make up the difference. And it was a way of redistributing the gains of productivity to workers, not in the form of extra pay, of higher wages, but in the form of extra time off. This was something that appealed in particular to feminist movements in the 1970s. The argument was this would be especially beneficial to women who had to balance the demands of like a family, family obligations and childcare with work, and something that appealed to environmentalists, to the early ecological movements of the 1970s, which argued that the way to improve the lot of workers was not to, give them more stuff, more purchasing power, but to give them greater time off. The culmination of all of this, I would say, was this law, the two laws that were passed in France that we're going to talk about today. In France, those laws go under the general heading of réduction du temps de travail. See, my pronunciation gets worse as the day goes on. Reduction of working time, RTT, as it's known in France. So the battle over the 35-hour work week in France is still a very significant one. It's a major fight. Just last year, the head of the Employers Federation, the main Employers Federation, which again we'll talk about, known as MEDEF, gave a speech where he said, it's finally time that we get rid of this law, basically. He said, even in the land of the 35-hour work week, we have to question these kinds of regulation of work hours. So it's an ongoing fight there. On the other hand, still some more left-wing trade unions, such as in France, the traditionally, as opposed to the CFDT, which was a socialist union for a long time, the communist, what had been until the 90s, the communist-led union, the CGT, for many decades, the largest union confederation in France, the head of that is still pushing hard for a general cut in full-time work hours. He wants a 32-hour work week. That's the position of the CGT, that is the solution to Europe's ongoing employment problems. Yeah? We'll talk more about this. So the 35-hour statutory work week was introduced in the late 90s by this newly elected government, the plural left government under Lionel Jospin, via two pieces of legislation known as the Aubry laws. They are named after Jospin's labor minister, Martine Aubry, who was a Socialist Party leader from the city of Lille and a very important figure, came from a very important family in the French Socialist Party. And it lowered the statutory work week, the length of the official full-time work week from what was then 39 hours to 35. And it established time limits for companies to make the move to shorter hours depending on the size of the company. So for companies with more than 50 employees, they had to make the move very quickly. For medium-sized companies between 20 and 50 employees, they were given an additional 2 years. And then for small businesses with fewer than 20 employees, they were also given extra time. For the plural left government, this was primarily intended as a job creation measure at a time when France was facing double-digit unemployment and had been for, really throughout the 90s. So at a time when employment was a major problem in France, it was also a major problem in other European countries during the 90s, including Germany. So this was kind of a general problem that governments were facing, and it reflected a demand that had become pretty standard among French labor organizations, which was the demand for 39 hours of pay for 35 hours of work. That was a demand that trade unions put forward. The first Aubry law, which was introduced in 1997 after an employment conference between the government, business leaders, and French trade unions, established this complex bargaining procedure to negotiate agreements on working time via France's traditional kind of sector, like branch level bargaining structure. So historically in France, the way collective bargaining worked is you didn't negotiate at the level of individual companies, first and foremost. You negotiated for all the workers in an industry, like the metalworking industries or, supermarkets. They had their own sector level agreements. But this also allowed for more localized deals on working time, which would be negotiated at the enterprise, at the company level. So more decentralized forms of collective bargaining over working time. That was something that was pretty controversial at the time, has become more controversial ever since. And it provided financial incentives for companies that reduced working hours more and more quickly and combined cuts in working time with agreements to hire more workers. So basically, if you cut working hours by more than 10% and you you increase the size of your payroll, of your workforce by more than 6%, basically the government would give you like half off on your payroll taxes, right? You would be exempted from paying payroll taxes. And this was supposed to, create or give companies a reason to negotiate deals on working time even more quickly than the time limits, yeah? There were also a whole bunch of other issues that came up with the cut in working hours. For example, if you're a minimum wage worker who makes a certain amount every hour, right, this could be a real cut in your wages, right, if you're working fewer hours in a week. So the law introduced things like a monthly bonus to compensate minimum wage workers for the loss of working hours. It actually led to a huge increase in wages for low-paid workers in particular in the years after the first Aubry law in 1997 was implemented. By the way, if you're losing me on any of the details, just let me know and I'll go back over things. I understand a lot of this is very new to people. There was then a second Aubry law in 1999. It's called Aubry II. In France, these are generally known as the 35 heures. It's just the 35 hours law. And they filled in the rules on working time reduction around things like breaks. Like, are breaks considered part of your time at work? What about time commuting? Is that considered, part of your working time? So there were big fights over that. the annualization of working hours. So now, as a result of the law, basically working time would be calculated on an annual rather than a weekly basis. It had to average less than 35 hours a week. But within that, you were allowed to make certain adjustments if you were a company, yeah? And other contentious issues as well. There were a bunch of issues that came up with the reduction in working hours. Aubrey 2 also weakened some of the provisions of the initial law, particularly around job creation. Like the requirements around job creation were essentially removed in Aubrey 2. Some of the time limits were weakened about how quickly firms, and especially smaller firms, had to make the move towards a shorter work week, and the collective bargaining procedures for making for negotiating agreements on working time. The initial Aubrey laws, the first two Aubrey laws, caused, I would say, the greatest crisis of French domestic politics in since the early 80s, probably. It led to a collapse of the leading French business organization. So when the proposal was first announced at this conference on unemployment between it's called a tripartite conference, the government, employers, and unions sat down. So the head of the main national business lobby at the time was called the CNPF, the CNPF, the Council of National Employers of France. Yeah, he storms out of the conference and he gives this speech. He gives a press conference on the steps of the hotel where the conference is held, and he starts railing at the Prime Minister Jospin and the Labor Minister Aubry and says they had lied to him, they ambushed him. He said employers need to wage a guerrilla war against the new law on working time. And within a couple months, he resigns. The organization shuts down. It is then relaunched under a new hardline leadership and given a new name. And it basically is committed to lobbying for employers' vision for reforming the French labor market. Above all, what employers objected to, and this is I would say, an ongoing issue in France and really across Europe, is the idea that the government has the right to tell them what the limits on working time should be. Historically in France, the way the labor market was regulated was via something called the hierarchy of norms. The hierarchy of norms said there's a very, very strong, there's a labor code that sets certain minimum standards. So that sets the baseline for what work should look like. Then within that, you're allowed to negotiate sector level agreements that cover issues not, detailed, not fully laid out in the labor code, but they can't violate the terms of labor law. And then within that, on the bottom, are these these company agreements, which are supposed to fill in the kind of details not covered in either the sector agreements or labor law. So it goes from labor law down to the enterprise agreements. Employers want to reverse that. That has been the entire goal of French employers around working time, and really, in all of the debates about labor law reform. They want to start with the company agreements and make that the kind of central node of labor market regulation, because they think, quite rightly, that is it's a more favorable terrain for them to fight with labor on than vis-a-vis labor law, especially during periods of heightened unemployment. Employers believe, and this is the experience in France and in other countries, that they can convince their workers to take deals where they trade concessions on wages, working hours, and other things like that, other employment-related issues, in return for job guarantees, right? In return for saying, we're not going to fire you. They can get their employers to give back all of this stuff, yeah? In France, especially, where there's a very different kind of industrial relations system. So unions union density in France is very low. It's under 8%. To be a member of a union basically means you join a union, it means you're an activist, yeah? So there are multiple unions represented in each workplace, and they're competing for influence and membership. And they, via a very complicated set of procedures, could negotiate collective bargaining agreements for all the workers in that workplace or in that industry. Yeah, but not all of the workers had to join the union to be covered by a collective bargaining agreement. So it's different than the United States. I don't know if this is clear. There's no closed shop. I know we're getting into the details of French industrial relations, but it actually really matters here. It really matters because essentially French labor unions have been historically weaker, much weaker than labor unions in other European countries. And so insofar as employers are able to reverse the hierarchy of norms, they can take advantage of the kind of workplace weakness of French labor in order to strike better deals. Yeah, if that makes sense, if you're following me so far. Yeah. So here are some questions that I pose and try and answer in my dissertation. We're not going to get to all of them, but the main debate in France has been what were the effects of the law and who benefited the most from it. Yeah. Was the 35-hour work week good for workers or bad for workers? Was it good for some workers, bad for some workers? What did it do to employers, to businesses? Was it bad for business? There's a lot of people who argue, as we'll see, that actually business got a lot from the reduction in working time, and so should be happy with it, but they're not. 2, how did France uniquely in Europe end up with statutory as opposed to just collectively bargained working time reduction? So literally there was legislation passed reducing the legal duration of the work week in France. That was not the experience in other European countries, where they relied much more on the traditional industrial relations system, on traditional forms of collective bargaining to change the rules on working time. Whoops, that should say 3, 4, 5. 3, what drove employer resistance to the measure? If it's true, as we'll see, that employers got a lot from it, why have they been so committed to this day, to this very day, even as the law has been progressively weakened, and we'll talk about that? Why are they so committed to doing away with a 35-hour work week? Why does it get their blood boiling so much to the point that MEDEF, that the main employers federation, is still a focus of a lot of their organizing and their lobbying efforts? For how have opponents of the 35-hour work week tried to roll it back without actually changing the statutory norm? How have they tried to get around the legal limits on the duration of work? And 5, why is the 35-hour work week remain such an important part of debates about labor law reform in France and really across Europe? I mean, it's a touchstone for those debates. It has been since the late 1990s. You should understand something about the effects of the 35 hours law in the years after it was passed. So in the 5 years after the length of the working week was cut from 39 hours to 35 hours, first of all, France experienced its greatest period of net private sector job creation since the 1970s. About 2/3 of all the private sector jobs that were created between 1977 and 2008 were created just in the 5 years after Aubry won. And the government estimates say that something about a fifth, maybe a fourth of all the new jobs that were created as a direct result of reducing working time, full-time work hours. Yeah. So it led to a huge growth in employment during the period when the law was coming into effect. Again, there's some debate among economists about the role of the law in driving that, but it seems like there was some kind of significant effect there. 2, the law led to a massive short-term drop in full-time work hours. Yeah, so, and we'll talk about that, but over the period, the 5 years after the law was implemented, full-time work hours, the estimates are, in actuality, the effective weekly work hours of French employees dropped by something around 5 to 6% for full-time workers. 3, and this is really crucial, there was a decline in part-time employment, essentially because part-time employees were getting full-time jobs. Yeah, because part-time employment was shifted into full-time work. As a result, income inequality dropped in France during the early 2000s. The OECD commissioned a study in 2008, that's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, that found that over the last 3 decades, at a time when income inequality has been rising all over the developed world, in Europe, the single greatest contributing cause is inequality in work hours. And that's been tied to a massive expansion in part-time employment since the early 80s in Europe. which has gone from something like 3% of all employment, depending on exactly which countries you're looking at, yeah, and what time period you use. At the beginning of the 80s in Western Europe, a little under 3% of all jobs were part-time jobs. By the period after the 2008 financial crisis, that had increased to close to 15% of all jobs, yeah? So there was a huge rise in part-time work. A lot more jobs were being done part-time. Those jobs are filled disproportionately, in some countries, overwhelmingly, by women. So, you know, and again, it's a controversial thing. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? One thing that's, you know, so is it giving people who wouldn't otherwise be able to work opportunities to work, at least they can work part-time, or is it something that is part of the decline in employment standards? One thing that's clearly true is that it has contributed to overall to income inequality. It's driven rising wage inequality, and that's led to it's been part of the overall rise in income inequality. Other things that were part of the effects of the new law, there was a huge amount of variation from industry to industry, company to company, and job to job to how the reduction in working time was accomplished. The new rules on weekly work hours gave firms the ability to, there were different modes of working time reduction that they could choose from. So for some firms, literally they just cut the length of the work week. They said, you're not working 39 hours anymore, you're working 35. Or before this law, usually people worked a little bit more than 39 hours, but you're just working shorter hours in a week. Other firms did it in other ways. In particular, the most popular way of reducing total work hours was to essentially give people extra vacation time in exchange for working the same number of hours. They're called RTT days, RTT days that you would get. So in an average firm, you would get something like 15 to 16 paid vacation days that are called RTT days. So there were also there are other issues that came up with the implementation of the law, particularly problems with implementing it in small firms. You can imagine if you're a small business that you're like, okay, I have 2 employees, now they're going to work less time, but you know, I can't afford to hire an additional worker, right? Even with financial compensation. So there were big fights over that. Small businesses were really overwhelmingly against the new law. Interestingly, in general, on average, the law led to big gains in productivity for employers. Basically, employers were able to squeeze more work, more output out of less work time. Part of the reason for that is that in companies where working time reduction was not tied to new hiring, basically workers were just working faster, right? It led to speed ups. And in some industries, that led to a lot of complaints from workers. For example, in hospitals, there were major issues about overwork after this law, after the 35-hour work week was introduced. And meanwhile, unions tended not to ask for extra wage. Basically, they let wages stay pretty much the same in the period after the law was passed. There was a period of wage restraint. But overwhelmingly, the law remained and remains very popular with employees. There is by 2002, at a time when there was a new election and the plural left government was kicked out of power, the survey data showed that something like 80% of employees who had experienced a reduction in their work hours thought the law was a good thing. They thought it was better that they were working less, that the effects of the law had been more positive than negative. So generally, the law remained popular with workers, not popular with employers, very much not popular with employers. And there was a lot of employer resistance, like I said, from the time the measure was first announced, and it continued for years after that. The result of that was that after the left was kicked out of power and the right swept to power in 2002 and remained in power for some time, the 2002 election was a disaster for the French left, really a disaster. There were 7 new reforms of the rules on working time passed within the next 6 years. Yeah. Whoops. Somewhere I said that. 7 new reforms passed in the next 6 years. And those basically what those did is they rolled back restrictions on employers employers' right to use overtime. So they made it easier for employers to use overtime. They made it, they gave employers greater flexibility to determine how working hours would be distributed, what employees' schedules would be like. And the upshot is that by 2008, the 35-hour work week was kind of a shell of its former self. It wasn't what it had originally intended to be. Really, and since then, since 2008, there have been even more cuts to the rules on working time, so that at this point, it's kind of a nominal limit on the duration of work. It's sort of like our 40-hour week at this point. Yeah, it's where you start calculating when overtime begins, but it doesn't have that much of an impact on day to day or week to week how many hours employees actually work. Yeah. So some of the issues that have continued, gone on, and that maybe we could talk about more. Issues in the reduction of working time that we should be thinking about. So first, in the 1970s, there were huge debates at the time when the 35-hour work week was first being adopted by European trade unions about how to reduce employee working time. Almost all the unions in Western Europe were like, yes, workers are working too many hours and they should have more leisure time, but they really differed on how to accomplish that. Probably the most popular way in continental Europe of reducing employee working time during this period was through early retirement schemes. Yeah, basically you reduce the total volume of hours workers will work in a career by letting them retire early. Yes, that was at a time of rising unemployment in the 70s, seen as it was like a way of buying older workers out of the labor market to open up space for new workers, while at the same time benefiting them through longer, lengthier periods of paid retirement, yeah, and more generous pension schemes. So the upshot of that, there was early retirement schemes adopted by French and German governments, West German governments at the time, both the left and the right. They all supported early retirement as a way of dealing with unemployment. Yeah, something in France, in the late 70s, something like 300,000 workers a year were retiring before the age of 55. By the end of the 1990s, the average effective retirement age in France had dropped to, for men, about 58, and for women, it was like 58.5, I want to say. So people are retiring before the age of 60 because of the widespread use of these early retirement programs. But for the more left-wing unions, that wasn't enough. Yeah, that was just not enough of a solution. It didn't fundamentally change the terms of work. Yes, you can retire early, but your actual experience in the workplace remains basically the same. Other ways of reducing working time that people were debating in the 1970s. One was extra weeks of paid vacation. In France today, you're guaranteed a minimum of 5 weeks paid vacation annually. In the early 80s, an extra week was adopted. It had been 4 weeks, then it became 5, in part as a response to demands for more paid vacation time. But again, the more left-wing unions were like, this isn't fundamentally changing the terms of the work relationship. So we want actually like a shorter work week. 2, there's the debate over how to shorten weekly working hours. So, the big trend in France since the late 90s, like I said, has been moved towards an annualized calculation of working time. That has good points and bad points. So instead of saying, okay, we want workers to work just 35 hours a week, what you'd say is we want workers to work no more than 1,648 hours in a year. So it's an average of 35. And then within that, we're limiting overtime. You can only work, 44 hours total in a week. That's in the first law. But otherwise, employers can redistribute those working hours. They could say you work more one week and less the next week, yeah, and we're going to compensate you with RTT days. Part of the problem with that, and this again has been a trend in work in Europe in general, is that it contributes to greater uncertainty about schedules. So you guys, it's not going to be unfamiliar to you. The idea that 1 week you're like, oh, I'm working 50 hours. The next week, oh, I'm working 30 hours. How do I plan my life around that? It's something that's a big concern for for lots of workers in Europe today. And then lastly, the big fight in recent years has been about these caps on overtime. So if we give people extra money, can we say, okay, they can work more than 35 hours a week? Yeah, employers want the right, and in fact have pushed for financial incentives to make overtime more attractive. Yeah, they want the right to increase overtime hours. The unions in general have tended to be more hostile to that. Another issue, to what extent should the rules on working time be mandatory and guaranteed via legislation versus collectively bargained? Again, employers want to move more towards collective bargaining, that being the focus of working time regulation. In other countries that also reduced working hours, it was done entirely through collective bargaining. In particular, in West Germany, and then after 1989, Germany, from the mid 80s, there was a big strike by the metal workers demanding a shorter work week. And that led to a series of collective bargaining agreements over working time reduction. The end result of that was that by the 90s, basically working time reduction was, again, just a way of trading shorter hours one week in return for less pay, right? And workers would get the, companies that were in financial distress would say, okay, we want you to work not 35 hours this week, but 28. We're only going to pay you for 28 hours, but we're going to keep your job. Yes? So it's a way of effectively cutting pay. That's not so different than part-time employment. Yeah. So that's the danger with a fully collectively bargained model of working time reduction. The other issue, which I mentioned before, does working time reduction come with new job creation? Does it require that employers make up the lost hours by hiring new people? Or are we saying, make up the lost hours however you want? And if you're not requiring that, does that just mean that the same number of employees are going to be asked to do more work in fewer hours? That's something that the French experience has raised as a major issue. But again, I think the biggest issue here is, how is it going to be accomplished? What employers want more than anything is the decentralization of labor market regulation via collective bargaining at the enterprise level. In the years after RTT, after the 35-hour work week law was passed, there were a proliferation of both sectoral and enterprise deals on working time. Working time became the single #1 issue in labor disputes in France. There was a spike in labor disputes and strikes and lockouts during these years, primarily around the question of how this decline in work hours would be accomplished. What employers in France say right now, and there's a lesson in this, I think, for us, is that they are for collective bargaining. They're not demanding an end to collective bargaining. What they say they want, though, is the term that gets used in France all the time is social dialogue. Social dialogue via local enterprise agreements. Yes? In essence, that becomes a way of undermining traditional job protections and labor regulations. Yeah? It becomes a way of breaking down labor law in France and sectoral bargaining and decentralizing the rules on working time in ways that inevitably benefit employers and have very, very much in France undermined trade unions. They've made it harder for trade unions to maintain job standards over the years. I want to show you some of the patterns of working time reduction in the developed world. And I have in my dissertation an extended comparison of France and Europe. And I should say at this point, the overall trend in the history of capitalism is towards fewer and fewer working hours. Yeah, people work much less than they used to. In the middle of the 19th century, the average employee worked like 3,000 hours a year. Some of the estimates are like a huge number of working hours. Today, it's less than half of that. And there are two reasons for that, two primary reasons. One is that, technological development, economic growth has meant that labor is more productive, so you can get more work out of people in fewer hours. But the other is that there have been an endless number of disputes between labor and employers over working time. Yeah. In this country, very famously, people know about the fight for the 8-hour day in 1886 in Chicago. So all my students are from the Chicago suburbs. So I say there was a famous incident in Haymarket Square. They don't know where that is in Chicago. I know. I don't think I know where that is either. But a labor protest for the 8-hour day ended in a violent attack on police. And then some of the labor organizers were arrested and executed, maybe on flimsy evidence that they were involved in that. But this has been a general trend, these fights over working time. So there's an overall decline, and that decline has continued in recent years. But today, the single greatest contributing cause to falling working hours is the growth of part-time work. And that has really accelerated in countries that rely primarily on collective bargaining as the road to working time. So here are the whoops. Yeah, it's where working time is dependent on collective bargaining or employer discretion. It has become a mechanism by which business secures increases in flexibility. It's another watchword in Europe. The European Commission writes all the time, pieces about the need for labor flexibility, and that ends up meaning kind of the undermining, the weakening of job protections. So I want to show you some graphs that illustrate this problem. Here are the two main roads to working time reduction I talk about in my dissertation. One is the German path. It began in West Germany. People know that Germany, there was in East Germany, the German Democratic Republic, and then the Federal Republic in the West, and they were unified after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. It was caused a lot of a real economic shock that really hurt German labor. But beginning in the mid-'80s, there was this route to collectively bargained working time reduction that began in the metalworking sector. Metalworkers Union was the strongest part of the German labor movement. And then at the time, and then even more in the last 2 decades, there has been a huge spike in part-time jobs, temporary jobs. They're called mini jobs in Germany. And that spike has been tied to a huge growth in low-wage employment, particularly in the early 2000s. There was a major growth in part-time and low-wage employment. Yeah, and in France, there is the legislative route to working time reduction via the two Aubry laws in the late 1990s. And collective bargaining was always based on these laws, on these legal regulations. Yeah, so what you saw in the period immediately after Aubry 1, the first working time law, was that there was a major drop in full-time working hours, and you also saw business-led efforts to achieve legislative retrenchment. Retrenchment here meaning like cuts in legal protections for workers. This is the overall decline in working time you see in the two countries between the early 80s and 2016. This trend line is in the OECD as a whole. So, and it's hard to get good data on employee working hours. It really varies. Countries have different ways of doing surveys, of collecting data. They have different definitions of what counts as working time. Yeah, so this is OECD data, which tries to harmonize those different definitions. You see here, there's an overall fall in total annual employee working hours on average. It goes from about 1,900 in the early 1980s to under 1,800. It's about 1,750 by 2016. Here is the fall in France, where actually in the 70s employees worked pretty long hours, and that's gone down as well. In France, there was the big drop right here is the period of the 35 hours law. And then in Germany, it's more of a steady drop, but this is for all employees. If you break that down, this is for full-time employees, just for full-time workers between the early 80s and 2016. What you see here is the enormous decline in France in the 5 years after the first 35 hours law. It then gets partially reversed in the early 2000s. But in general, you can't see the legend for this, but in general, let's see if I can. Sorry, this more. There we go. Yeah. So here I have the OECD countries. It's a big drop in the late 90s that France played a major role in. So here's Germany, and then this is the 16, what at the time were the 16 member states of the European Union. And you see in these other countries for full-time workers, it's a bit steadier in Germany than it is in France. Conversely, here's average weekly work hours for part-time employees. So it's not just that there's more part-time employment in Germany, it's that they're working, part-time employees work fewer hours than they do in France. There was the big thing in France in the late 90s was that a lot of part-time employees started working full-time, but even among part-time employees, you saw a bit of an increase. These are harmonized definitions, a bit of an increase in average weekly work hours for part-timers. That's in France up here. Here's Germany. And then you see divergent trends in the growth of part-time work. I mean, in Germany, part-time employment is just going up and up and up and up into the early 2000s. In France, it stays pretty steady, and then there's this drop in the late 1990s. And that, as a result, means that France has much lower levels by the mid-2000s of income inequality than Germany. Germany was one of the 3 European countries that saw the greatest growth of income inequality in the decade before the 2008 financial crisis. It's really totally bound up with these changes in the work process. So I know I've given you a lot of information. There's a lot that I've left out. Let me just say that there's going to be a lot of. I think that as COVID ends, there's going to be a lot more discussion of some of these attempts to experiment with a 4-day work week. There have been experiments done in Sweden, in Iceland, in Spain, and in Japan, in some other countries as well. Insofar as you let employers get away with anything, they're going to use this to their advantage. They'll negotiate deals on working time insofar as it saves them money or lets them reorganize the work process. But it will not lead to higher employment, and it will, if anything, lead to speed ups and the collapse, the weakening of traditional work standards. The lesson of the 35-hour work week, and particularly of Aubrey 1, was that you have to force it down their throats, or else they'll use it they'll force it down your throat. So that's my takeaway from this, and I'll leave it there. And if there are questions or things you guys want to talk about, I have a lot more to say. Thanks for bearing with me.
You can now see the chat and your applause. So folks in the chat, if you have questions, feel free to pop them in there and we'll be able to monitor the questions in real time. And Jonah, maybe if you get questions from the floor, just kind of like repeat them to make sure folks at home can hear. Okay. Opening it
up. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, first of all, I love the idea that this is going to be a trade press book. I think we could all use a popular book on why we should and how we can work less. The question I have is to pick up on your last point on the idea that if you want this reform to be successful, you have to ram it down their throats, right?
Yeah.
And it seems to me that there's like this puzzle that this case is puzzling to me, right? Because France would not seem to be the paradigmatic case of left power resource on the continent.
Yep.
Union density is really low.
Yeah.
The business at least seems like pretty well organized, and like it's just the conditions do not seem in many cases to be auspicious. So like on the one hand, it seems like this could be a story about the surprising resurgence of like corporatism as a way of getting this, as opposed to traditional like noise of like labor power, that it's the regulatory state that actually makes this like a strong regulatory state with the Socialist Party in control of it makes it powerful even in the absence of worker resources, right? But at the same time, like it's not like your outcome, the outcome here, I think the story sort of hinges on what the outcome is. So like on the one hand, you tell a story about this reform being a success.
Yeah.
On the other hand, there's retrenchment.
There is.
So like, I wonder if you could get like one.
Yeah.
Which version of the outcome should I believe? Is it really a story about
short-term success and long-term failure?
Success and long-term retrenchment, in which there's just convergence with the German model.
Yep.
Okay.
There is.
And if that's true, is this a story about how actually the regulatory state alone, in the absence of strong labor power resources, can't do anything?
Yeah.
So I'm curious, like, what you think, one, made it possible, and two, is the absence, how important is the absence of power resources?
Yeah. So there are two questions here. One, which I talk about in the dissertation, and I just don't want to try your patience, but the question is how France ended up with this. The second question that I pose, in particular, because the French left and especially the French labor movement does not seem stronger than the labor movements of other countries, and it definitely wasn't. It was weaker than the German labor movement. There was a huge strike in Germany around this that won working time reduction in 1984. It was seen as a historic agreement. France had much lower levels of union density than countries in Northern Europe like Sweden or Denmark. It did not have a particularly strong social democratic party. The left was always split between the communists and the socialists in a way that was pretty debilitating, and that split infected the labor movement, which was fractured along political lines. So how did France get this? And then the other question is a larger question, which is, okay, but you're saying this was sort of successful in the short run, and in the long run, it didn't mean anything. So, it got rolled back, it got retrenched, and there's ongoing retrenchment. And isn't this just a different path to the German story? Let me start with the second question, which is, to a great extent, yes, that's true. In the long run, this law got so severely weakened, in part with some of the concessions that were made to business in the second Aubry law, at a time when literally during the parliamentary debates about Aubry II, the French business organizations were rallying outside, and that the heads of them were testifying inside and accusing the government of terrible, terrible crimes against humanity. I mean, there's a famous quote where the head of the now refounded MEDEF says to the government, "Your law is archaic, it is undemocratic, it is uneconomical," and he goes on, about how terrible this was. So there were concessions made in Aubry II, and then after the right returns to power, it's just not quite open season on the 35-hour work week, which still exists technically for political reasons, but they really roll it back severely. The difference is that there's this example of the 5 years after Aubry I, yes, which plays a major role in French political debates. There's some kind of memory of it that is very important for labor, and it means that debates about working time still have this significance. There's that kind of model that still motivates people in a way that I would say is not true in the same way of Germany. I mean, in West Germany, by the late 90s, the dream of a general cut in full-time work hours to 35, this new model of work, of humanized work, was dead, really dead, and even the main proponents of it, which was the Metalworkers Union, really didn't push it very hard, and they said, okay, we'll accept flexibility, essentially. Yeah. So the politics of it are different. And it's important for us to think about, because that example was so tremendous in the 5 years after the law, for all of its limitations, and there were limitations, the incredible amount of job creation, the incredible fall in full-time work hours, and what that meant for people, I would say, is very significant. The other thing is, it's a more complicated answer. I don't know, does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
About the how France ended up with this law?
I'm just saying, if your book is
a
trade press book directed at an American audience,
No, I know. I'm going to start with a map. I was telling Megan, I'm going to start with a map of Europe that's like, this is France, this is Germany. These are two countries in Europe. I do it with my students all the time. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, I interrupted you.
People would want to know, is this something that, in a way, could only have been possible under corporatism with Socialist Party, in government,
Yeah.
regulatory state? So I'm just.
Yeah. And so you're asking, was this only possible in the specific context of Europe, of France? Yeah. And so the answer, and again, this is a complicated answer. So Phil asked about corporatism. Is it French corporatism that made this possible? So my argument in the dissertation is that actually it's the comparative weakness of French corporatism. Corporatism here meaning a model of economic governments that relies on agreements, regular agreements and cooperation between business, labor, and the state to ensure that the economy is functioning, that the rules around employment are being enforced and maintained, that deals about things like wage increases or working conditions are tied to a vision of a kind of a broader, like what the economy needs, basically, yeah? So corporatism was the model of economic governance that existed in different forms. It's kind of a vague term in other parts of Europe throughout the post-World War II period. In France, the great irony is that collective bargaining was weaker. Labor law was stronger than in other places. Collective bargaining was weaker than in a country like Germany. Not only that, but French unions were always weaker, in part because the rules set up governing labor organization, labor relations after World War II reflected the concerns of the conservatives and the Gaullists. Charles de Gaulle, who was the president of France for a period of time, the kind of hero of the resistance in World War II, was a conservative nationalist, and he was very afraid that the communists were too powerful in the labor movement, and he wanted to weaken the trade unions so that the Communist Party did not have so much influence on the French capitalism after World War II. Again, I know this is a complicated and unfamiliar story for people, but it meant that, for example, French unions not only never got the closed shop, but they were reliant. So only unions that were recognized by the state could negotiate collective bargaining agreements. There were 5 recognized unions, and they relied on the government for most of their funding. Because if you don't have the closed shop, you don't have enough members, where do you get money to function as a trade union? The answer was that most French unions in general got most of their money from literally from the government. It was a way of keeping control over them. One of the things this meant, though, was that it was not possible to pursue agreements on things like working time purely via collective bargaining. There had always been efforts to do it via the collective bargaining route in France, and they failed again and again and again. Yeah, they ran up against the unwillingness of business and labor to sit down and hash out an agreement, which made France different. Again, is this making sense to you? Yeah, so by the late 1990s, there's a desperate situation in France where they have tried to, the government had been pushing, actually even conservative governments, trying to get employers and unions to sit down and negotiate deals on working time. It had never worked. They're facing double-digit unemployment. There are all of these demands for shorter work hours, that this is going to be the route to reducing working time. There was a lot of political pressure on the state, yeah, and on the French administration for reasons I can get into, and that essentially meant, and if you look, I did a bunch of interviews with French policymakers at the time, and you can find interviews with them, in the press as well, and there's extensive research on this. But basically, they're like, we didn't know what else to do, so we passed this law, basically, and then employers got really mad at us, and we panicked, like we didn't, So it was the limits of corporatism as a mode of economic regulation in France. Yeah, this was a period of a lot of political contention over labor market reform, the mid to late 90s. And that is my argument, is that's what made France unique. Actually, you want you want to be less reliant on collective bargaining in general. Yeah, I would say that's still true, and this gets at what you're saying. insofar as you rely on voluntary agreements of any sort, you're going to get bad deals, in part because labor no longer has anywhere the power resources to win good deals, right? So you have to figure out a way of politically ramming it down employers' throats if you want to make it, yeah. Go ahead, Megan.
I think Dawn had.
Oh, go ahead, Dawn.
In the chat.
Oh. Oh. This is,
No.
no.
Sorry,
Dawn said you have no reaction to all of this.
But it sounds like you're saying, right, so ultimate, oh, no, wait, Don does have a question, go Don.
Go ahead, Don. This is really awkward to stare at myself. Go ahead. Ask a question. Ask away.
Can I just ask it on the mic?
Go ahead, you type. And did you want to say something?
It seems like you're saying, right, that ultimately it has worked out with the 35-hour work week benefits employers, yet there's still fierce opposition.
Yeah, there's some ways in which they got some benefits from it. And in part, they got benefits from it because the law just wasn't strong enough, right? It should have been stronger. They should have imposed stricter regulations. They should have said, no, you have to reduce everyone's working hours to 35 and figure it out, and hire more people. And that's the only way to do it. They limited themselves too much, and nonetheless, even as the law has been chipped away, employers are still furious about it.
And kind of vice versa, right? So like
Yeah.
for workers themselves,
It's an important symbol.
okay.
Yeah.
Even though it doesn't necessarily have the same benefits in terms of pay.
Yeah, even though it doesn't mean as much. I mean, labor is worried that if you get rid of it, people will just be working forever and ever and ever, or full-time workers will be, and then it's just going to be, everything else is terrible part-time and temporary jobs. But more than anything, I think it's a stand-in. It symbolizes something that's about a much larger battle at this point because of that history, because of the memory of it and the role that it played in the late 90s and early 2000s and those fights. I mean, really, the collapse of the CNPF was, like I said, I think the greatest crisis of French business organization since World War II, since the Nazi occupation, right? This group had been the dominant representative of French business for 50 years. Yeah, what do I think is the gist of the book for a U.S. popular audience? Is there any hope for U.S. labor rights here? No, we're screwed, Don. No, that's a really good question. As Amazon takes everything over. Yeah, I mean, obviously part of the issue here is it's a great question. It's of course the question. It's a very different model of capitalism that we have here. There's no history of this kind of regulation, right? Not in the same way. There's a way in which, yes, this is much more relevant in parts of Europe today, where there's still some of the institutions of the kind of post-war, whatever you want to call it, social compromise. There is a larger lesson here, I think, which is that it's possible for people to work less and for that to be something that makes work more available and more equal, right? In all kinds of ways. That it doesn't have to be the case that the trade-off is between job creation and, like reasonable work standards. And that no matter what you want, you gotta force it on Amazon, Yeah.
But I think that's where I'm running into.
No, I know. Why should people in the U.S. care? Right.
So like, the situation you characterize, it's a crisis situation.
Yeah.
And there are no other doors to open.
Right.
If all the other doors that could solve the thing are closed.
Yeah.
So as long as that policy idea is sort of at the top of the pile, like, this is right. So like, I just like think for U.S. audience, like, what do like?
Feels like who cares? Yeah. What's the there are no doors open. Go ahead,
Yeah,
Louis.
I wanted to go off of what you were saying earlier, asking about
It's a good
how
question.
far this law had been chipped. You know, does it have any?
So chipped.
Does it have any?
So part of what, so the answer is not,
Off of that, is it so defanged at this point that it is now just a symbol of something to be like a boogeyman?
no, it still matters. The way that it matters is that lots of employees still get RTT days, basically. So lots and lots of workers get days that they can take off in compensation for working overtime on other weeks, basically, yeah? So there is some kind of trade-off there. They've raised the annual, anyway, so part of what's happened is that they've now passed laws that say companies that are in economic distress can temporarily exceed the 35-hour-a-week average. And so companies are like, great, I'm in economic distress. You know, I can't do this. Give me more space for flexibility. They've also raised the actual like cap on how much overtime you can work in a week. So in certain circumstances, you can work up to 60 hours a week, and which is obviously not what the intent of the 35-hour work week law was. So if you talk to activists in the French labor movement, they'll be like, it's defanged completely. It doesn't mean anything at this point, which I don't think is quite true. When you talk to business people, they're like, oh no, it's a big deal. It's really a big deal. The way they tend to frame it is that it's part of an issue in France where no one wants to work. That's how they think about it. We need to change the culture, the norms, right? People don't want to work in France. They think they deserve all this time off, and we have to change the values of the French nation, is how it gets framed. And that is kind of the main problem with the 35-hour legal limit. Yeah.
Which is interesting given that this year, during the pandemic.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to work now, right?
Right.
And so kind of changing relationships to work here, we're actually stuff coming through really glorifying the 4-day work week.
Yeah.
In Europe in general.
Right.
Just some of that different kind of like work-life balance, like we should have it the way Europeans do.
Yeah.
And
Europeans don't have that great. Yeah.
right, exactly. So kind of been thinking about it as a book for a US audience during the Great the Great Resignation and some of our rethinking of flexible work policies and remote work and kind of reorienting our relationship with work on a collective level. It's like interesting to think about this.
I mean, it is a good question how you make this relevant for a US audience and not a specialized dissertation about European labor markets. That's a hard question that I have to think about, And I actually don't know enough about the debates about the United States, in part because there hasn't been this level of reform ambition, right? It wasn't the case that there were American trade unions that were like, oh, we're socialists. And by the way, we think everyone should work 35 hours a week and be paid 39 hours for it. Not in decades and decades, at least, right? Yeah, I mean, there were times when some of the CIO unions would put forward a demand for 30 hours work for 40 hours pay. I mean, that was a demand of some of the unions, like in the 30s, but definitely not recently. That's not the scope of what people are thinking about, and that's a real question. So that's an issue, for sure. Yeah.
General, I sort of wonder if for an American audience, there's like 3 things that you want to do probably.
Yeah.
One.
Phil's laying out 3 things I should do for an American audience. Go ahead. This is great. Can you write this down?
Here's your 175-page book. Section 1. Why should this be a demand? Why should it be the demand? It seems like you're making an argument that it should be the demand for labor at a moment of weakness.
Yeah.
2.
Section 1, why this demand?
Why this demand? Section 2, how people make this demand in the past.
Yep.
How do they ram it down the throats?
Yep.
With colorful language. And then 3, how is this demand enforced and how do those enforcements of the demand fail?
Yeah. So section 2, wait, what was section 2?
Section 2 is making the demand.
Making the demand, and section 3 was.
What are the conditions under which labor can successfully make this demand? Section 3 is what are the conditions for successfully enforcing? them?
Yeah, what are the conditions for successfully enforcing this? That's
Write
great.
that down on call verso.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I gotta do is, for a 175 page book, I have to lop about 100 pages off, my, no, but yes, that would be great. There is stuff that's being written, I should say, in English, coming mainly out of Britain, about the demand for a 32-hour week or a 4-day work week. The problem is that almost everything that's written tries to frame this as shortening working hours as something that can be good for business and it's going to be good for everyone. Now, of course, you need business to be functional for there to be jobs, or else what's the point, right? If no one has a job. But that way of framing it as something that could be mutually beneficial is exactly the wrong way to think about it. And here's what's going to happen with all of these experiments. What you're going to find is that there are going to be professional jobs where people are allowed to make this move to a shorter work week, but the demand is going to be they do the same amount of stuff, but do it in 4 days, so work faster. And then there are going to be a bunch of jobs like Amazon where they're like, no, that's not how we're rolling. Or else if we are letting you work 4 days a week, it's because you're a part-time employee and you're getting lower wages and no benefits. Yeah. So it actually can contribute to a bifurcation of the labor market in a way that's bad for everyone, I would say. Of course, that's going to appeal to a lot of people who are like, I'm working too many days. But if the end result of this is that you create a new work standard where it's like professionals who get to work 4 days a week are going to work a lot. You're going to be working late into the night. You're going to be working all, just trying to get all this work done in whatever, just in a few days. And then everyone else, it's the same old. That would be a bad change, not a good change. If you want to make this a good change, then yes, you need the section 3. What are the conditions for this to work?
That's a really good point, because the stuff I'm seeing in the work I've done and research I've done on flexible work policies pre-COVID in the workplace, it's very much sold as like your employees are more productive in working 4 hours a day. This is great for everyone. Certainly not like pushed through by any sort of union collective bargaining, labor law at all, right? No. It's more like individually negotiating flexible work policies with your particular manager, right?
Yeah, which can be important for individuals. It's true,
But it's available to some people, as you're saying, right? So some people, not others.
And what you want to do is create general work standards to say, if you have a kid, yes, you should get lots of paid parental leave, right? But it shouldn't be like, okay, and now you're going to make it up with some point in the rather than flexibility, actually enforcing real norms, right, that are good for workers would be the better solution to.
Yeah, it's very much like a carrot stick sort of situation in the way that it plays out.
Right. Yeah. Any other? Or they give people 10 to 13-hour shifts. Yeah. Yeah, which is no better. Thanks for letting me talk for an hour. Appreciate it, guys.
Thank you, Jonah.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks. Thank you. Should I close this?
Do what Phil said.
Hey, do what Phil said. That's good advice in general. Thank you. Thanks for coming.
I'm excited to read this book.
Yeah, I'm excited to write it. I feel like I have the author photo already. I was telling my students, but now I just need the class. Thanks, guys.